Alright, in this video here, what we're going to do is provide a very generalized overview of the XNA framework. Now, we have talked about XNA in the past. Back in Volume 1, when creating the Canon 3 game, since that game was being created as an XNA Windows game, we had to stop and introduce you to the world of XNA. But it was a very simplistic introduction. All we talked about was the game template that's provided by Game Studio Express in order for you to start a Windows game. We went in there, we showed you all of the different methods that were provided, things like initialize, load graphics content, update, draw. We talked about what those methods did, and then we, implemented the methods by putting our own game code in there. Next thing you know, voila, we've got a Canon 3 game running. But we've not yet taken the time to talk about the technology that, XNA sits on top of. What really makes up XNA? So that is the idea of this video. This video is just to provide that overview of the XNA framework. So, XNA framework, what does it provide? Well, it provides two things. So let's jot some of this stuff down because I find it very important. So XNA framework, that is an R, I do promise. It provides two things. The first thing that it provides is our game framework. And I'm talking about the framework that we will use to implement a functioning game. So let's go and jot that down. The game framework. So what makes up the game framework? Well, simple. Things like the environment. That's provided for us. Are we creating a Windows game? If so, here's a window. Are we creating an Xbox 360 game? Well, here you go. The entire environment is already established for us inside of the XNA framework. So first thing, environment. And as I said, that's things like Windows, Xbox 360. Outside of that, how about the game loop? That's provided for us. So we can easily manage timing already through everything that's provided by the XNA framework, as opposed to us having to go out, create our own game loop, and then our own types for managing timing. So that's already set up. We have, of course, easy access to rendering. All of the required elements to get something drawn to a screen is already provided. So we can easily draw or render. How about input? The ability to utilize the mouse, the keyboard, a gamepad, all of that stuff, once again, is already provided. So as far as I'm concerned, the game framework is the ultimate starting place for creating a game because it allows you to get in there and start focusing on just the game. Logan, if we were to create a game, say the exact same game that we're going to create in XNA, a Windows-based game, in C or C++, and we started out in C or C++ with just a blank screen, a brand new, fresh project, and we were going to build the entire thing ground up, we would have a long ways to go just to get to the point of where we have our framework that XNA provides as a starting point for an XNA game.
Right, because if we started in C, the level we'd be working at is just a single Windows application. That application is going to do nothing and not even have a window until we physically create a window through the Win API.
And that's a bit of time invested in just getting that up and running.
So we would spend a lot of time just coding a window. And then after we had a window, we'd have to come up with other facilities. We'd have to make sure we had the proper APIs in order to draw. We'd have to make sure that that drawing was happy with the window that we had created. We would then have to worry about how input was working on the system and what devices were used. And then write wrappers or even deeper control systems for those.
Exactly.
So we would have a lot of work to do for each, you could say, physical device, including the graphics card, input devices, display devices, and so on.
Exactly.
Whereas in XNA, a working version of all that is provided as a base.
So it allows us to get up and running with our own games much faster. So this is the first key element of two different elements that the XNA framework provides. First is the game framework that you can start creating your game inside of. The second piece is the content pipeline. Now, the content pipeline is very important and can become a bit sophisticated once you climb up under the hood and you start taking a look at how it all works. We're going to provide you with a very general overview of the content pipeline in this video, and we're going to be focusing on it in more depth a little bit later on because it's quite interesting how it works and how you can extend it. But first of all, what is the content pipeline? The content pipeline basically allows for you to create your game assets in third-party applications like Photoshop or Maya, and then import those assets into the XNA world. So basically, let's go ahead and jot some of this down. First of all, it's going to allow for asset importing. And by default, it supports many types. And if the type's not supported, here's the fantastic thing. We can create our own importers and processors for handling custom third-party data. Now, what do we do with that data when we handle it? Well, it's simple. Basically, it gets imported, processed, and compiled. So the content pipeline handles compiling so that we finally have our binary format that's utilized inside an XNA game, which is .xnb files. So, as I said a second ago, let's just go ahead and jot this down too, and that is the content pipeline is easily extended. Because once again, if you decide to create your own modeler, which saves out to your own proprietary format for whatever reason, you can easily extend the content pipeline by writing your own importers and processors so that you can go about bringing that data in, processing the data, compiling the data, and then outputting a .xnb file, which then can be used by the XNA framework inside your game. Very good stuff. Again, we're not going to be talking about it in depth, but I will provide a pretty good overview before this video is over. Now, this framework, all this stuff, where does it exist? Check it out. We're going to open up a folder here inside of, all right, let me take a deep breath. C:\program files /Microsoft XNA /XNA Game Studio Express /version 1.0 /references /Windows, since we're looking at a Windows game at the moment, /x86. We have a series of DLLs. These, ladies and gentlemen, are the assemblies that make up the XNA framework, starting out with the ever more popular Microsoft.xna.framework.dll. From there, going down into the .framework.game.dll. And then from there, we get into everything dealing with the content pipeline. Content pipeline itself, the core DLL, and then the effect importer, the FBX importer, the texture importer, and the X importer. So a whole bunch of different importers. And that is the heart of the XNA framework. So what I'd like to do is just spend a minute and talk about some of these DLLs, talk about the namespaces that are provided inside of them, and some of the types that they provide. And believe it or not, some of these things you're going to be recognizing. So let's go ahead and jump over here to another document real quick. And how about we start out with the Microsoft .xna .framework .dll file. All right. So what can we find inside of this DLL? Well, we can find a bunch of different main namespaces. Let's focus on some of what I consider to be the main namespaces that you're going to be using. First of all, now, I'm going to abbreviate this like crazy. All of these start out with Microsoft.xna . But I'm not going to write all that down just because it'll take forever. So Microsoft.xna . The first namespace, framework. And if you were to look inside the framework namespace, you're going to find several different types, some of which you've already seen. Things like point, rectangle, how about vector 2? I know they've seen that. but we also have a vector 3 and a vector 4. That's just a few of many different types that are provided inside of the framework namespace. And again, really, the namespace is Microsoft.xna.framework. The next one, Microsoft.xna.framework.audio. So the next few that I'm going to jot down are preceded with everything, including framework, then dot, and in this case, audio. Now, once again, many different types are provided inside these namespaces. I'm just going to jot down a few of the ones that you're going to be seeing often. So how about sound banks and a cue? A couple examples of types that are provided inside of audio. Now, Microsoft.xna.framework.content. So once we have that content compiled into a binary format, the .x and b file, we then need a way to actually get it into a game. So there are different types provided inside the content namespace. One of the very important ones is going to be the content manager. Content Manager gives you that load method where you can bring stuff right on in, and you've already seen that before. You're going to be seeing it a lot starting very soon, actually starting in this very section of videos. From there, how about the graphics? So again, it's Microsoft XNA Framework Graphics. Inside graphics, you're going to see things like the graphics device, sprite batch, you've seen sprite batch. We've used them for doing a little drawing. Texture 2D, another one you've already seen as we were bringing textures in for the Canon 3 game. Let's see what else we have. How about Microsoft.xna.framework.input? You'll be learning a lot more about input in this section here, where it's going to provide types such as our gamepad, our keyboard, and our mouse. Once again, several other different types, and you'll begin becoming exposed to them starting a little bit later in this section of videos. Okay, so that's a quick look at some of the namespaces, some of the much more popular ones that you're going to find inside the Microsoft.xna.framework.dll file. Now, the next one that I want to take a look at is going to be and I'm going to start abbreviating now, the Microsoft.xna.framework .game DLL file. So what will we find inside this assembly? Well, a namespace called framework. And this is going to allow everything inside here to exist, well, basically as if these two guys were in the same namespace. Because they are in the same namespace.
As long as those assemblies were referenced side by side,
you got it.
You would have the things from game placed into the same namespace as all of those things seen in the framework DLL.
Exactly. So this is the only namespace I'm looking at. Actually, it's the only one that's there. What are we going to find in here? What type of types, if you will? We're going to find our game. And this is very important because when we create a game inside of Visual Studio Express, this is what's going on. Basically, we get a game one that extends game. So this is what gets extended when we create our own game. And we're going to be taking a closer look at that coming up in a few minutes. And then we also have, when creating a game, these things get created, which we'll be talking about in just a second. We get a game host, We get a game window. And of course, we also get a graphics device manager. Just like we have a content manager, we also have a graphics device manager. And actually, you've seen both, At this point, back in Canon 3, they've seen the Content Manager, they've seen the Graphics Device Manager. Just quickly looking back at everything I've written down here, they've seen the Sprite Batch, they've seen Texture 2D, they've seen Point, they've seen Vector 2, they may have even seen Rectangle, maybe. Can't really remember. But so a good deal of what you have worked with or have seen in the past, well, now you're seeing where they actually come from what assemblies and from within what namespaces. So these two DLLs, the Framework DLL and the Game DLL, they make up, as far as I'm concerned, that first part of the two elements that are provided by the XNA framework. The first part being the game framework. Now it's time to start talking about the content pipeline. So what I'd like to do first is go ahead and come in here and create a new whiteboard and draw some pictures, because we all know I love to draw pictures. So we've got some applications like XSI. How about 3ds Max? How about Maya? Let's see, how about Photoshop? That's good enough, just to name off a few. So here we are with all of these third-party applications for creating our own assets for the game. And then sitting over here, we've got a content pipeline. Should almost just draw it as a big cloud, but the box will work just fine. And then finally, over here, we've got our XNA game. So how does all this work? Well, the idea is that we come in here and we basically, I'm actually turning this sideways. That feels awkward to do, but that works. Turn my Wacom tablet sideways as if this was like a piece of paper. That's kind of funny. So all of this data here goes into the content pipeline, and then from the content pipeline, afterwards, basically what we have is compiled binary data in the form of an XNB file that can then be used by your XNA game. So basically, these third-party applications will generate, as I said, external assets in the formats of things such as JPEG, bitmaps, targas, FBX files, .x files, etc. And of course, we can create our own. Now, what happens in the pipeline? Three things. First, importing. Processing. And then finally, compiled. And then our result is some sort of .xnb binary file. So how does all this work? Well, our different files are imported by importing types inside the content pipeline. And then in the content pipeline, they are then processed and then compiled. And then the output is sent back out as a file that is now in a proprietary format for XNA. Now, the content manager, as we just talked about a second ago, will load this stuff into your XNA game. Well, that didn't exactly line up, but you get the idea. So that is just a very generalized overview, how you start out by working in your own application of choice. You create your assets, you save out that data, then you turn around and use the content pipeline. You guys have seen the content pipeline in action in the past, but you've never really taken the opportunity, where we haven't at least shown you, what gets generated. But you've seen how we can go in and we can basically add our own textures and all in, right, Logan?
Right, and the whole idea is that content creation applications that may be used are going to have a bunch of different file formats.
That's right.
Whereas an XNA game is going to have its own internal format.
Yep.
And the content pipeline allows a streamlined method by which you can take these different pieces of content that may be in different types and different files and bring all of that together into a format that can be used by the game.
Yep, and let's think about this. If we were creating our own game from scratch, C, C++, whatever it may be, whatever language we choose, and you had content that's being created in XSI, 3ds Max, Photoshop, now you've got to write your own importers. You've got to write your own way of getting those formats converted over into a format that you're going to use inside your game.
Not only that, you have to come up with what kind of internal format you want. So you have to build that, if you want to call it the X and B step, the internal format. You have to define that first. You want to define how data is stored inside your application, and then turn around and write the necessary importers to bring anything from any of your artist applications so that it can be rendered properly in your game.
Not necessarily a 10-minute task, eh?
No, that's a significant task, and one that continues throughout pretty much the life of the application, because your own internal format might change. Someone might bring a new application into the pipeline.
Exactly, but with the XNA framework, I can jump over in Photoshop, whip up a texture real quick, go over to the content pipeline, import that texture, voila, there's an X and B file, and then in my game I can simply use the content manager to load it in, and it's ready to be used.
So you're looking at 2 minutes instead of 2 weeks.
You got it. So there is a very quick overview of the content pipeline. Now let's spend just a second and talk about the DLL. So let's go ahead and how about we create yet another blank sheet of paper. All right, so this time around, once again, I'm going to continue abbreviating things. So we've got the Microsoft.XNA.framework. .content. .pipeline. .dll. And what's provided for us in here? Well, let's talk about some of the namespaces, because there's quite a few. First of all, the pipeline namespace. And inside the pipeline namespace, we have a lot of different types provided, but just to give you an example of some of the really important ones, how about content importer? And content processor. If you're going to have an importer and you're going to have a processor, you really need a base starting point in which you can build all of your importers from and all of your processors from. Like with the content processor here, if you're going to create your own content processor, you'd use the content processor here as the base that you would then build upon for working with your own data.
This only makes sense if you think about things in an object-oriented manner, in that the content pipeline, when used in Visual Studio, is going to have to know how a processor works, how a basic processor works, some of the things that a processor is going to do. It has to know about those things before it can do anything with it. So if you're going to make your own, you have to follow those rules. You have to follow that blueprint.
You got it. Another namespace that's provided for us in content.pipeline is going to be, well, the processors. Because, once again, the content pipeline provides the ability to import a lot of different types of data already. So inside here, what kind of things are we going to find? Well, we'll find types such as a texture, processor, so that I can work with textures. How about a font texture? Processor. Or, it's very easy to get 3D models into XNA. We've got a model processor. real small real quick. And there we go. That is model processor, I promise. Another namespace that you're going to find. How about serialization.compiler? I'll just put compiler here. But if you were to write out the whole thing, it would be Microsoft.xna, .framework, .content, .pipeline, .serialization, .compiler. So as you can see, that's obviously a lot to write. But how about a content compiler? Once again, the whole idea is having things such as importers, processors, and compilers that will allow you to import custom data in, compile that data, or process it, compile it, and get it output as an XNB file. And this is all the stuff that's provided. Now, we've got several different, there's like 4 different other DLL files that are provided for working with specific type of data. Once again, just to start it out with, we've got Microsoft.xna. I'll only write this once for this whole section. Framework. .content. .pipeline. .effect importer. .dll. We've got FBX importer. .dll. We've got texture importer. .dll. And we've got X importer. .dll. Working on that D. There we go. And now, if you're not familiar with some of these different formats like Effect, FBX, or X, don't worry, we'll be talking about those as we progress further and further into the class. But of course, all of these, Microsoft.xna, .framework, .content, .pipeline, and the particular importer. So all of these different DLLs that I'm showing you here make up the content pipeline. And then back over inside the framework namespace, the XNA or the Microsoft.xna.framework. In that namespace, we then have the content manager that allows us to go out and grab .xnb data, bring it in to our game that we can then utilize. So that is a very quick overview of the 2 main parts, or the 2 parts basically for XNA. The game itself, the game framework, and the content pipeline. So let's go ahead and let's see how well we've done here, Logan. That's not too shabby.
Not bad.
Not bad at all. So jumping all the way back here to the very beginning. Yeah, there we go. So once again, the idea was just to provide you with, well, an overview of the framework. And so we've now talked about the different assemblies that are provided with XNA Framework, and we've shown you the DLLs, and we've talked about what's inside the DLLs, just pointing out some of the key things. We've talked about how the framework divides up into the games framework and the content pipeline portion that allows you to bring external information in and save it into a format that can then be used inside your game. And that's pretty much it. In the next video, what we want to do is go ahead and introduce you to Reflector and show you how you can start taking a peek inside of these assemblies, along with, well, many other assemblies, and start using that to show you in the video after that what actually goes on when you create a game inside of XNA and launch that game, to get a window and what happens to get that game loop up and going. So with that, that is going to wrap up this video over a general overview of the XNA framework. Thanks a lot.